my goal is to cut X amount of dollars, go, right?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, that's the role of a CFO, right? So and again, not in isolation, but in collaboration with every other leader. Well, here is where we need to be, right? We need to be at this margin to generate.
Welcome to the Financial Innovations Podcast. I'm your host, Daniel Villani. We're helping CFOs save money and time by investing in cutting edge technologies. Really excited today to introduce Andy Ferguson. Andy, great to have you on the show.
Yeah, great to be here, Daniel. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so one thing that, kind of where I wanted to start was, we were talking a little bit before the show here, about industry experience and, what makes a good or great CFO. I just wanted to, maybe kick us off with, with the story that you told me about, what I hear a lot, especially, people interviewing me to help their organizations. They like to start with how much industry experience you have, have you done it? For 10, whatever arbitrary number of companies they have in their head, other healthcare companies or whatever, before. And there's kind of that, perceived notion that, if you come in there and you say, hey, I've done this a million times, this is the first time in your space, that makes you not as as qualified there. Maybe if you want to start by telling us about the story of the best CFO you've met and kind of the things that were successful there.
Yeah, it's a great question, great point, and it brought to mind another story. Recently, was reading in Becker's, and they had asked a bunch of healthcare executives, how to get to the next level of innovation and what they need to try, and just reading some of their responses. And one response was, "Well, we need to look to other industries. We need to look outside of healthcare because there are a lot of great processes and a lot of great structures and tools and technologies that we can learn from." I said, "Yeah, that's great." The next person down said, healthcare is unique. We can't look to other industries. So there still is that mentality that healthcare is different. And in some ways it is. And in many ways it isn't. As I was sharing with you before we hopped on, the best CFO I ever worked for had zero prior healthcare experience. He actually came from a manufacturing background. But what he was able to do through his financial acumen was break everything down to a unit of cost. And that is our unit of service and calculate a cost per unit of service. And I'm not talking about adjusted discharges as a unit of service, which has been around since I started in healthcare probably 30 years ago. And everybody talks about the inadequacies of that unit of service. This individual had us create a structure where we were able to look at labor cost per unit of service, supply cost per unit of service, and total cost per unit of service, and break that down by functional area: nursing, ancillary, large ancillary departments, lab, radiology, pharmacy, etc. Was it perfect? No. But it gave us a direction to head into, and then it allowed us to marry variation to that target, which is really what you're trying to get to. It was a discipline that most CFOs can't. I've struggled with getting them to get their head wrapped around it because it is a different type of approach to managing cost.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting that you say that because I mean if I had a dollar every time I hear somebody say, "Oh, we do things so differently," we're unique, versus other places, and then you start looking at things and they're describing a basic allocation to you based on square footage, and it's like, all right, I'm struggling a little bit to see how you're so unique that you can't just use similar things over here. But it's there seems to be that kind of preconception of hey, like nothing can really replicate how we do it because we do things so differently versus some of the fundamentals, to your point of let's take maybe something that's a little bit larger of a cost issue, whatever you name it, and let's start breaking it down into smaller pieces for analysis.
Correct, and that's the thing. I mean, healthcare is unique certainly in how we get paid. There's no other industry in its right mind would have a reimbursement structure like our industry does. But our cost, in our approach to it, we've got direct costs, we've got quote unquote cost of goods sold, and we have overhead, same as other industries. Now, you'll hear a lot about, well, they aren't taking care of patients. We have lives at stake. Well, yeah, that's true. But then again, when you start talking about process, not necessarily from a cost perspective, but from a quality and safety perspective, manufacturing industries have accidents. They have to have the same level of high quality and safety as healthcare does. So I think there are a lot more similarities in how we can get down and do the analytics than there are differences.
Yeah, and healthcare is something I guess I hold near and dear to my heart. My wife's a pharmacist, and she worked at a hospital, and so I always would tell her, "Hey, if you mess up, someone might die. If I mess up, someone's loses a little bit of money." But so a lot of respect for people who work in that industry, because the stakes are much different than what I do. But but to your point that a lot while there are parts that are unique, I think it's there's a lot of similarity there. There's a lot of same types of concepts, even though maybe some specifics are different from organization to organization or industry to industry. But if you're able to break down those processes, be able to look at hey, what we need is a way of being able to analyze, and let's start looking at what we can compare before we start to see what strategically should we do or not do.
Right, right. I mean, and my background, I started in as a cost accountant, which I say is not real accounting. It's kind of this. And if you ask CFOs today, how many of them are confident? How many of them have a cost accounting system that allows them to actually calculate what the estimated cost is for a particular procedure? I'd be curious to know what that data looks like. Many of them might have some idea, but when it gets down to a partial hip, a total hip, when it gets down to a bypass operation or whatever it is, really looking at, well, how much of that cost is direct, how much of it is indirect, how much is fixed, and how much of it is variable. I don't know how many organizations could say they have their arms wrapped around that.
Yeah, yeah, no, definitely. And in terms of as you're breaking down costs and so forth in there, are there particular thresholds or metrics that you're more interested than others?
There are probably two, and I would say, and it's not surprising, right? Because it's the two biggest components of an organization expense, and that's labor and supplies. So really, what you want to try to do is break it down into by metric. You look at your labor cost per unit of service and your supply cost per unit of service. Compare that then to a target. That could be a budget, that could be a benchmark, that could be whatever. Then break it down further when you look at the variance and say, well, how much is due to rate of the thing and how much is due to volume of the thing? And that allows you then to say, well, yeah, I'm over budget. This is the discussion I have with CFOs and operators all the time, right? You can be over budget on a total expense line item, but if your expense per unit of service is in line, fine. That just means you had more volume, right? And the same thing with rate. Well, if your volume is on target, but your cost per unit of service is off, then you start unpacking why. Oh, well, guess what? My labor cost per unit of service is high because guess what? I had to backfill with overtime or with travelers or something else. So it's really understanding those two things, rate and volume for labor and supply cost. If you get your arms around that, you've tackled 80% of the issue.
Yeah, and this is a great topic, and this is why we started the show. Had guests like yourself on as well. Highly recommend anyone tuning in to subscribe to the channel, and leave any comments here. But that rate volume mix analysis is something that I see quite often, and it's funny because I worked on a project where there was a large consulting company out there trying to convince the client that nobody does that kind of analysis and that it doesn't mean anything. And I was like, this is kind of standard in the industry and something that everybody looks at. So I don't understand why why you're doing that.
Is it standard in the healthcare industry?
Yeah,
Standard
this was
everywhere else.
right. Healthcare, manufacture. This was a manufacturer, the CPG company, and so forth. But it's to your point is, being over budget isn't necessarily a bad thing. It could mean that that you're serving more customers, right, and your costs are higher than what you planned because you have that increase in volume. So, it's funny because I see a lot of companies that are we want to implement technology because some, vendor showed us some fancy, charts and graphs and dashboards and, this type of analysis and that type of software. And, you lose the fundamentals in the process of what's, making businesses work strategically, well, right. And so, it's yes, you can go and put the best dashboard system in and, have all this, cutting edge technology. But if you can't understand the, what did these metrics mean? How is this going to impact us? What direction do we need to take on all of this? Just pretty charts and diagrams. It's no different than just printing out a picture from the internet and putting it on a screen and saying, this looks great, right?
Yep. I had a CEO I worked for. I consider him a mentor, and he said three things. He always asked three questions, and it stuck with me. And this has been a dozen years or so ago. What's important? How do you know? So what? And so it tags right to what you just said. Okay, well, what are the important metrics? Okay, well, and then say, well, how do you know they're important? But then, so what? What are you going to do with them? If it's just a dashboard and you're really not going to act on them, then why go through the exercise of having somebody gather the data, report it out, and then have this discussion if nothing happens with it? I tell you, back to that CFO that implemented the unit cost. One of the ways, and I'm not going to. We actually made it an incented metric. Those things. And again, when you start creating incentives, and it's a double-edged sword, right? So the incentives you create drive the behaviors that you get. But monetary incentives tend to drive behaviors. Sometimes it's not necessarily the right behavior, but if it's the right incentive, it'll get people's attention.
Right. And it's important to combine that with the right checks and balances in place to make sure that, to your point there, those incentives aren't getting, abused. I know there are, banks out there that incentivize people to open accounts and people are, just creating fake accounts just because, hey, I get $1 every time someone opens an account. Let's just open 10,000 accounts, over here. But, it's funny because a lot of organizations, there are things that are important. It's not tied to anything performance wise or anything of the people that are monitoring those metrics. And then they go and look and say, hey, how come we didn't, how come we're not strategically growing or getting to where we want to be? And it's, well, you have to make sure that every aspect of your organization is tied to the things you want to improve and look at and grow there.
Yeah. I'm a huge proponent of a balanced scorecard. I mean, you got to have it, right? You can't, have quality suffer just because you're trying to chase a cost per unit of service metric, or patient experience and those types of things. So you have to have all of those things balanced out, but they have to be meaningful and they can't be overwhelming. I was at an organization in a turnaround situation. I mean, there were 50 plus metrics we were trying to figure out. And it's like, well, how do you make sense? This one's up, this one's down, this one's sideways. How do you bring it all together into some sort of cogent, explanation of what's going on?
Right. and looking at the dependencies between, some of those metrics, it's, if X goes up, Y is also going to go up, and you're looking at them independently and you're saying, oh, 10 of these metrics are going up. Yeah, but it's, what's the cause of that, right? And sometimes it's all
Correct.
driven by, by the same thing where, it's a lot of people just put in, and, I use the dashboard example all the time just because, usually if you see any of them, they're just flooded with 500 different metrics and, all that on there, because people think that the more stuff you throw on a single dashboard, the better vision you're going to get of the company over there. And then it turns out that, you're either looking at too much stuff or you're not looking at the right stuff, and, you're missing some of the things that you probably should be spending more time on.
Oh, it's totally accurate. I mean, think about the dashboards that we have on our cars today. I mean, with the technology, there could be thousands of things we should be looking at, but we're only looking at what, five, six, and if that, and that's all you need. And everything else is not going to make or break the organization. Those are the important ones to look at.
Right. No, that's spot on. So I know that, you mentioned about, cost per, per unit of service. Are there other, balanced scorecards? Are there, like, what for an organization, they come in the healthcare industry, they come to you, they say, hey, we want to improve our, our organization. Like what are some of the recommendations you would give to them? Obviously, the initial answer is going to be it depends, right? And on, a bunch of factors, right?
Always.
You're right. The answer always starts there, right? And I hate when people give the answer, because it's usually just it stops and ends there. It's just it depends, end of sentence, and then there's that awkward pause, right? But I think that, it's always helpful to understand it depends on what, to understand, hey, how do we, take the conversation forward? So like where would you typically start if, someone, came to you and said, hey, look, I'm in the healthcare industry, we're looking to improve the performance, what should we be looking at? Like where should we be getting started?
Well, I think you need to break it down into manageable buckets, right? So there's a financial component to it. There's always a quality and safety component to healthcare. And as you look at those things, then unpack them into smaller, manageable buckets. I'll go back to what's important. How do you know? So what? Um, but you really need to look at, when setting any KPI, you have to have clarity of what it is and how you're measuring it. Because if there's not that clarity about where you're getting the data from, how often is it going to be refreshed, and who's accountable for it, and then what are they going to do with it, it's just a recipe for disaster. And I've seen it work very well, and I've seen it work very poorly, because nobody was really clear on how the metric was defined. Nobody was really clear on who owned it, and nobody was really clear on the, well, so what if I'm off target, then what, and what are the remediation actions that the organization has to take to get back on target. So it's understanding the things behind the metric, not necessarily the metric itself, that I think are equally, if not more important than saying, well, yeah, I'm looking at labor cost per unit, or I want to get to a productivity target of the 95th percentile, or I want to get my HCAP scores up, or whatever the metric is. It's all that background stuff, but it has to be balanced. It can't be focused solely on one at the expense of the other.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, that's a great point, because, too often, companies look at, hey, what's the bottom line in terms of, what does this mean from a finance perspective? And, like it's an important thing to look at, and you definitely have to do it. But to what you were saying about, you can't just go and raise your, revenue or cut costs at the expense of, now it's more dangerous to, get procedures here, or, to get any kind of service here. You have to consider everything, in totality, not just, the individual silo. So you could go and say, hey, look, I'm, just the CFO of this company. I've just got like my metrics and my incentives are tied around financial performance. But you always have to, be cognizant of that bigger picture of, how do we can't just say, let's cut the number of bandages that we stock just so that we're under budget, guys. We only bought 2 bandages. We're under budget. Give me my bonus for that, right? And then it turns in that people are going in there with open wounds that can't be bandaged because you don't have them, right?
Yep, yep. Exactly right. I mean, there's, saying it's, you can't cut your way to long-term profitability. You can do it in a very short-term way, typically around FTEs, which I believe, and I heard this from an executive I worked with. She said, if we have to get to that place where we're going through these massive reductions, that's a failure of leadership. And I believe that. But I've also been part of them, and so I know how difficult and how painful that is. But to your point, then you don't have the people necessary to take care of the volume of business that you have, and then they get burned out and they leave. So then your turnover increases. Their quality of patient care decreases. The patient experience decreases. So that ripple effect, as I look at it from the role of a CFO, it's to make sure that the organization and the caregivers, physicians, clinicians, ancillary staff have the tools and resources they need to take care of the patients. That's it. And the metrics help provide direction. Are we on track or are we off track? And that's how I look at them. They're just mile markers in an ocean.
Right. And it sounds like, for you to achieve that goal, it involves working very closely with, some of the operational, executives over there to make sure that, you're not just, trying to cut your way to, to profitability, as you mentioned before, that it's doing so in line with, the strategic direction and, of the organization and, keeping patient, quality and all of that as high as it possibly can.
Oh, it's an absolute collaboration, teamwork, team effort, whatever you want to call it, across the entire. I'm going to let's just say C-suite, but it really is organization wide, because the CFO isn't going to go out there and tell the COO or the CNO, how to staff, or what is the right mix. Do we need to have an LPN model or do we need to have an RN model? We can talk about, and what I've done with clinicians in my career, I'll never tell a clinician how to practice. All I'm going to do is say, here are the implications of the decisions that we're making. And that's it. But ultimately we have to drive to a number because, and I don't know if it was Sister Jean or which sister said it, no margin, no mission. Back in the day, and I kind of turned that to more margin, more mission, right? And we shouldn't be ashamed. I mean, I honestly, I hate saying this. I'm going off on a tangent. So,
No, you're good. You're good.
you know, I try not to use not for profit because that tends to set an expectation or a mindset. It's a tax status. That's all it is. What we want to do is certainly make as much margin as we can to reinvest it back into the communities. Most, whether that's through services and resources or whatever, but most tax exempt organizations operate in some socioeconomic challenged areas. The for-profit entities typically don't do that, and there's a reason for that, and that's part of our system. But that's the reality of the situation we're in. So we've got to be very mindful of the dollars, and we need to go after every dollar we can, whether that's top line growth or on the expense side.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Because to your point, a lot of time, many times people think, oh, not for profit, that means, what you're doing is going to be free. It's gonna, it's gonna be
Yeah.
everyone doing it, and at the end of the day, whether or not you're charging for it or not, there's still, rents, property taxes, whatever to be paid, and staff wages and things that that need to go out there. So there's the aspect of, are you doing this to put money in shareholders' pockets versus, doing it to say, how do we, take this and whatever we make do, 10 times more next year, or, whatever that roadmap is.
We're doing it to put money back into the community through services and other opportunities that create value in those communities we serve.
Right. Yeah, no, that's great. I think one of the challenges that for lack of a better word, that I've run into in many areas is things like regulations, right? And making sure that it's not just about analyzing the numbers and trying to get to the best possible analysis and things there, but also understanding the being in healthcare, you got to make sure that HIPAA is being protected, and all of that as well. Do you run into like those kinds of challenges and stuff in what you're doing, just in terms of maybe that there's some metrics that you might want to look at, or be looking at, and you say hey, look, we've got to avoid doing this or that just due to regulatory?
There are a lot of things. Certainly, HIPAA was one, and you talk about violations of some of the regulatory statutes, and then you go, okay, well, how do you prevent that, right? So then this gets back into, well, if I never incurred the expense, how's it a savings? And so then you start talking about, well, I need to make the investment so that I don't get hit with these fines. Or a really good clinical example is that you start looking at your malpractice claims, right? I was part of an organization that really did implemented a plan around neonatal. I always have a hard time saying that, neonatal mortality rates. And they, over time, they were able to demonstrate, and I actually validated from a finance perspective, that not only the number of malpractice claims went down, but the actual cost per claim went down. So that is the true definition of bending the cost curve, right? So costs are going to go up, but if they don't go up as much as expected because you're doing something, that's value. What I've tried to do, you'll hear CFOs talk about hard green dollars and soft green dollars. I totally agree with that. Hard green dollars you can see in the general ledger, they come out or they don't come out. The softer green dollars are what I would call economic value dollars. You know it's the right thing to do, but you might not see a financial return, or at least an immediate financial return on it. And those things, when I try to talk about with value props and business cases, I try to get away from return on investment to return on goals, because I want to make this business case or this initiative or project, or call it whatever you want. There's always going to be a financial component, but there are other things you want to track as well. And that gets back, circling all the way back to our balanced scorecard, right? And so it keeps everybody's eye on everything, including the financial return. But maybe there's a patient experience return, maybe there's a quality metric, maybe there's a cost avoidance like the malpractice stuff. It's those types of things that you want to keep your eyes on as well.
Right. Is there say someone's looking to get into a CFO role in a healthcare organization, maybe they're coming from outside of the healthcare field. Are there recommendations or things that you think, hey, coming in, it would be great if, you had either, whether it's a skill, whether it's, any just kind of tips and tricks on people being successful in the healthcare field?
I would say try not to stay in the finance lane. Try to understand operations, IT, clinical. I've been blessed with the opportunity of reporting up to just about everybody in the C-suite: CFO, CIO, COO, and Chief Clinical Officer, all with I had a somewhat of a kind of bent to it, but I got to see how the CIO looks at finance. I got to see how the chief clinical officer looks at finance, and the same with the chief operating officer. Because it's being able to look at it through their eyes. those guys didn't get necessarily into their roles. And I'd say the same with clinicians and service line leaders and that, to understand DRG reimbursement, to understand cost reports, to understand unit cost. So you got to help them and live in their world. And I think that's the best advice I could give. Go spend a day in the OR. Go see what they do. Go tour on a night shift, right? Stay with the nurses at night. See what they do. Nurses are the biggest part of an organization's labor force. Go see what they do. See how you can help them do things differently.
It's funny how everyone kind of has an opinion on, we should either cut this or invest in that or whatever, without doing those kinds of things. Cause, it's not, I mean, there's nothing like fancy about it. It's the fundamentals of, so whoever you're supporting, go see how they go and do their job. And then you can get an idea of, what can be improved or not. But it's very easy to, armchair quarterback of, oh yeah, you need this instead of that, or you shouldn't have done it this way, that you should have done it that way, just, without ever having set foot, in the space that they're operating and see what they're doing.
That's it. And you hit the nail on the head. And I think if you're particularly if you're moving into a corporate role, what ideas sound great when you're sitting in the corporate office and you go out to the field and you start talking with people and you go, ooh, yeah, I didn't think about that. Oh, yeah, that's another issue. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's very easy to look at things, like starting out, I worked for a small consulting company and, they made the decision of, hey, we could be very profitable if we just don't have as many consultants and have everybody working, 70 hours a week. And now, we still get to charge all the hours. Right. And you say, wow, that, you look at the numbers and that's insane margins and profitability over there, and then you look at the attrition numbers and you say, all right, well, this is not, probably sustainable for what you're looking to do. And it's, about having that full picture of, the operations, and not just the finances itself.
Yeah, exactly right. The other thing that I would say, because, you know, um, cost optimization, for lack of a better word, is a never ending thing. And you really need to focus on how to change the culture of the organization to put that into their DNA, because it's never going to go away. The reimbursement rate increases will never match the cost increases that every organization. So you're always going to have to find 2 to 5% of savings every year. So start building that mentality into the organization so that it's not just another flavor of the month. And we've all been there, right? Oh, well, so and so talked to another consultant. Well, now I got to talk to these guys again. I'm going to tell them the same thing I told the last consultants. So really start building that into the organization, and that empowers the staff, right? Because now they're in control of the reductions or improvements that they're making. And it also then, reduces your reliance on external consultants, and which in my experience, tend to be a little hit and miss.
Right. Yeah. No, that's a really good point. In terms of, like looking for cost savings, like you said, that 2 to 5%. Are there certain areas that you think are like, I don't want to say easy targets for the reduction, but things where you look at it and you say, hey, it's lower impact, where you say, hey, here's kind of the first place I would start looking at, because it tends to not, have a negative consequence on quality or, any of the other metrics that would put in the balance scorecard there.
Yeah, I would say, historically, and I would say rightfully so, right? The places where most organizations look are labor, and supplies, right? That makes up, throw out a number, 70 to 80% of an organization's expense base. So that's where you're going to look, right? And you have limited resources to chase down those opportunities. So you want to maximize that. But it's everything else other than that. It's the back office business functions you need to look at. It's your facility management stuff. And those things, in my experience, tend to get deprioritized for the reasons that I mentioned earlier. But that dust in the corner. So think about it. Think about an organization that has $4 billion of expenses. Let's just make that up. Let's say it's 4 billion. Let's say that 20% of that is not related to labor or supplies, right? So now you're talking about $800 million. If you save 10% of that, now you're talking $80 million a year. That's a 2% lift in operating margin, when the average operating margin right now is less than 2%, or right around 2%, I think. So now you're talking about doubling somebody's margin. Now you talk about, and so without cutting FTEs, right? And without changing physician practice patterns, without impacting care delivery, without doing all of those things, which quite honestly are either hard or painful, hard because if you have to involve physicians, that's always a challenge, or difficult because you're dealing with people's lives and cutting FTEs. So look at that dust in the corners that you probably haven't looked at in years, if ever.
Right. Right. And, maybe as you start looking at some of your processes, you find efficiencies where you say, okay, we can automate a process that, would normally be manual going through there. And, there are ways that you can say, hey, look, we can save some money just by looking at existing processes that we do today and saying, how can we optimize this rather than continuing to just do things the way that, that they've always been done.
Absolutely. I think right now the biggest opportunity is providing insight through your AP data, because I get most organizations, they don't their ERPs are reporting tools, right? They're not analytic tools. When you start asking somebody, do you know Mr. CFO, Mr. Mrs. CFO, how much you're spending on consultants and for what? Do you know how much you're spending on your total utilities and for what? Or your IT contracts and for what? Do you know how often you incur late fees because you're not paying stuff on time? Or if you're double paying stuff, happens all the time. And again, that's a process that you just have to put in place. But I would bet the majority of organizations don't do that because they're focused on the 80% of the expense base, labor and supplies, to drive big change. Well, at some point, that field's going to be plowed, right? There's just not going to be that much more there's not much more juice they can squeeze out of that. So look at this other stuff.
You could say your nursing staff in half, and now you got half your labor cost, right? But at the end of the day, it doesn't make it sustainable or a winning strategy, going forward over there.
Well, it's the same point you made. Yeah, sorry to interrupt with what you were doing in your job. Yeah, you could do that, and then you're going to pay overtime because you have to have a certain level of staff, and in many states have minimum staffing standards. So you have to do that, and then you're going to burn out the remaining nurse workforce. So how does that make sense?
Right. Right. Doesn't make sense in healthcare in my field when we don't have the overtime rules over there. It makes a lot more sense for them. But yeah, I mean it's funny because I feel like a lot of CFOs, finance executives, they look at what are my biggest expenses and how do I cut from there versus to your point on sometimes some of these efficiencies come out of these smaller buckets. They might threshold certain things and say, hey, I'm not going to look at anything that's under, $100,000 in a $4 billion budget over here. And then, sometimes it's just a lot of those $50,000 things here and there. we talked about this with a previous guest on the show, like looking at software licenses, and you're buying the same product from two different vendors, and you got enterprise licenses to the two things. And do you need to have two, competitor products to the same, same type of technology or whatever? Can you consolidate? Can you, you've got, I have clients where they're still paying for users that quit or retired 10 years ago, and they're still super administrators to the system with the keys to the kingdom over there. And it's you're paying for licenses for people that haven't worked for your company this decade. And yet you're looking at, hey, how can I try to cut staff that we might actually need in order to save the money we need to save, versus how do we be smarter about the things we are paying for and looking for things that we may not need, versus just looking at what are our biggest buckets, and how do I cut 2% here, 1% there to get to my overall goal.
Yep, yep. I couldn't agree more. I would add, what I would tell people, and I'm guilty of it, right? Well, if it's only 50,000, why chase it, right? Um, but what I would also say is, well, let's look at it from this framework. If every $100,000, that's basically a nurse. So that's one less frontline staff position that we won't have to cut. I used to previous one of my stops would talk to folks, and I would say, who in this room thinks that we can cut more frontline staff without impacting quality? Hand never went up. Never went up.
Going back to your have that balanced scorecard approach there of, when you look at things as a big picture versus just the how do I cut the 50K I need here or there or whatever, it's a different mindset. It's a different process that you go through in terms of how do you get to the goal, versus when, you're just looking at, all right, my goal is to cut X amount of dollars, go, right?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, that's the role of a CFO, right? So and again, not in isolation, but in collaboration with every other leader. Well, here is where we need to be, right? We need to be at this margin to generate this cash flow, to generate this reimburse or reinvestment into the organization, capital plans, etc. This is where we need to be. How can we get there, right? And many times it's a multi-year plan, and you need to acknowledge that you're not going to go from being at the 10th percentile to the 90th percentile overnight. You got to have a multi-year plan to get there, and set those KPIs along the way, and then adjust as you move down the path.
Yeah, no, those are great points. I know that we're coming up close to the end over here, and really appreciate you taking the time to go through this. I know I certainly gathered a lot of information from this. I know our guests or our audience here will as well. Again, highly encourage anyone watching, just please comment. Any questions you have, happy to answer any of those, and subscribe to the channel. But any other words of wisdom, nuggets of information that you can provide here before we wrap up.
Um, yeah, I had a colleague who said, what was her quote? Uh, Keep asking questions like a third grader. Why? Right? Why? I had another person close to me, a mentor. He said, "Don't let people rationalize away your questions." Well, it's because of this, but why? And keep digging until you get to actually the root cause, or what is really driving it. Because without that, you're just going to be chasing your tail or going in circles. So have that curiosity, right? And get out there, get out of your office, and get out on the floors and really see what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, I found like that's really where the innovation lies, is the person who isn't willing to just accept the, oh, we can't do this because we have to do that, and I remember I was on a big project. They volunteered us to work over the weekend, and because we were running behind, and they were like, hey, we need you to go through these, 7 steps over here to get us back on track. Here's the standard operating procedure. We just need you to go through it. We looked at it. The process can't be automated. It's just a manual thing. 90% of the people went through and they're going through the different steps, and I'm looking at the steps and I'm like, I don't understand why this can't be automated. Like, sure, like maybe we can't automate all 7 steps, but like if we could automate the first 5, isn't there value in that? And like 20 minutes later, we sent out an email. Hey guys, I automated steps 1 through 5 for everybody. So just do 6 and 7. And, we're off the phone and everything in 2 hours instead of spending, the 2 days of the weekend doing it. Right. Because it's, someone said, hey, we looked at this and we can't do it. It's no, you can't do it. That doesn't mean that it can't be done. But if you just take everyone's word for it in that, space, then you say, all right, well, let's just stop and not look at it, versus if you say, all right, let's, put a fresh pair of eyes on it, maybe a couple people putting their heads together and say, how can we do, the best we can do. And, maybe automating half the process is still, more valuable than having the, 30, 40 people go through all these steps, over the entire weekend.
Yeah, that's a great example, and couldn't agree more. You just have to. Why not? Why can't we do it?
Right. 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 And that's how a lot of great, ideas and things start. And that's how you kind of get to that culture of, how do we improve? Well, we don't improve by just doing the same things we've always done for the last, X number of years. We improve by looking and seeing, well, let's kind of challenge, even some of the, core concepts that we have, and see, is there a way to do it better?
Yep. It's a great summary.
Andy, it was great having you on. Really, once again, really appreciate the time here. Just in terms of, if audience members want to, connect with you, get in touch with you, what's the best way for them to do it? Is it LinkedIn, or there, other preferred methods that you have?
LinkedIn's probably the best for me right now.
Perfect. That sounds great. Well, once again, really appreciate having you on, and we'll have to have you back in the future to see, what other things you're up to.
Yeah, I'd love to. Thanks for having me. It's a great conversation. So appreciate your time today.